A teenager on public transport starts mocking Clint Eastwood, thinking he's just some old man with no bite left. But when Clint responds, his words leave the teenager and everyone else on the bus completely stunned. What he does next is a lesson no one will forget. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartwarming stories like this, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow we've got another story you won't want to miss. It was a late afternoon in San Francisco. The city was alive with its usual chaos, cable cars clanging in the distance, people rushing through crosswalks, and the hum of conversations blending into the background. On a crowded public bus, passengers were packed shoulder to shoulder, many of them commuters just trying to make it home. Seated near the middle of the bus was Clint Eastwood, dressed in a plain brown jacket and worn jeans, with his iconic squint partially hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He was an unassuming presence among the passengers. He sat quietly, gazing out the window, his hands resting on a folded newspaper in his lap. A teenager sitting a few rows back noticed him almost immediately. With earbuds dangling around his neck and a skateboard propped against his seat, the teen looked like he was itching for trouble. He nudged his friend and whispered, "Hey, check out that guy. He looks like some kind of wannabe cowboy." His friend chuckled, glancing over. "Yeah, what's he doing on the bus? Did his horse break down?" The teenager laughed loudly, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. Encouraged by the reaction, he leaned forward in his seat and called out, "Hey, cowboy! You lose your ranch or something? This isn't the Wild West, old man." Several people on the bus turned to look, their expressions a mix of amusement and discomfort. Clint didn't move. He kept his eyes on the window, his face calm, almost like he hadn't heard the teenager at all. But the teen wasn't finished. "What are you, like, 100? Shouldn't you be home watching reruns of Bonanza or something?" Laughter rippled through the bus, but it was uneasy, like the crowd wasn't sure whether to find the joke funny or offensive. Clint finally shifted slightly in his seat, tilting his head just enough to glance at the teen from the corner of his eye. His expression was unreadable. What happened next made the entire bus fall silent. Clint slowly turned his head toward the teenager, his piercing gaze locking onto him like a hawk eyeing its prey. The teenager froze for a moment, caught off guard by the intensity in Clint's eyes. But then, regaining his bravado, he smirked and leaned back in his seat. "What's the matter, cowboy?" the teen taunted. "Cat got your tongue?" The bus was completely silent now. All eyes were on Clint as he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but commanding. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You got a lot to say for someone who doesn't know a thing about the man he's talking to." The teen blinked, momentarily unsure of how to respond. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his tone defensive. Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It means you're making a fool of yourself, kid," he said calmly, "and you don't even know it." A few passengers chuckled softly, but the teenager's face turned red. He leaned forward again, his smirk replaced by a scowl. "What are you, some kind of tough guy?" he said, trying to sound intimidating. "Newsflash, old man, you're not in a movie." Clint let out a quiet chuckle, his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said. "This isn't a movie, but if it were, you'd be playing the part of the loudmouth who doesn't know when to quit." The passengers erupted into laughter, and the teenager's face flushed even deeper. His friends nudged each other, trying to stifle their own giggles. Clint turned back to the window, his expression calm once more, as if the exchange had never happened. But the teen wasn't ready to back down just yet. The teenager clenched his fists, his embarrassment turning into frustration. The laughter from the other passengers stung, and he wasn't about to let an old man get the better of him. Leaning forward, he raised his voice. "Yeah, laugh it up," he said, glancing around the bus. "I mean, come on, what's he even doing here? Shouldn't a big-shot cowboy like him have his own private jet or something? What's he doing on public transport?" The bus grew quiet again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Clint remained still, his eyes fixed on the teenager with an almost unnerving calmness. The teen, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "Or maybe you're just washed up," he said with a smirk. "You had your time, Grandpa, but now you're just another nobody trying to relive the glory days." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Even the teen's friends exchanged uneasy glances, realizing he might have gone too far. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up, his tall frame towering over the seated teenager. The bus seemed to shrink as Clint walked slowly toward the teen, The sound of his boots on the metal floor echoed through the silence, each step deliberate and steady. He stopped just a few feet away, looking down at the teenager with that signature squint that could stop a storm in its tracks. The teen shifted nervously in his seat, his smirk faltering. "What?" he said, his voice not quite as confident as before. "You got something to say?" Clint crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "it's funny how the loudest ones are usually the ones who've done the least." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The teenager's face turned beet red as the other passengers murmured and nodded in quiet agreement. Clint wasn't done. "You think you got it all figured out, don't you?" Clint continued. "You think respect is something people owe you, but let me tell you something, kid. It's earned, and from where I'm standing, you haven't earned a thing." The teenager opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Clint's gaze didn't waver, and for the first time, the teen looked away, unable to hold his stare. The teenager sat back in his seat, his bravado all but gone. The other passengers watched intently, their eyes darting between Clint and the teen. Clint stood there for a moment longer, his calm yet commanding presence filling the space. "You know what I've learned over the years?" Clint said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The strongest people, the ones who make a real difference in this world, don't waste their time tearing others down. They lift people up. They treat others with respect, no matter where they come from or what they look like." The teen's friends exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of what to say or do. One of them tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. Yeah, man, he's just joking around, you know?" Clint turned his sharp gaze toward the friend, who immediately shrank back in his seat. "Joking?" Clint said, his voice still calm but firm. "There's a big difference between a joke and disrespect, and if you don't know the difference, you've got some learning to do." The bus driver glanced back through the rearview mirror, clearly intrigued by the scene unfolding. A woman sitting near the front of the bus spoke up, her tone firm. "He's right. Kids these days think they can say whatever they want and get away with it." Clint raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the bus. "This isn't about shaming anyone," he said. "It's about understanding. This kid here," he gestured toward the teenager, "he's got potential, but he's wasting it trying to impress people the wrong way." The teenager looked up, his face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "What do you mean?" he muttered. Clint leaned down slightly, his expression softening just enough to make the moment feel personal. "You've got a voice, kid," he said. "But if all you do is use it to tear people down, no one's gonna listen when it really matters." For the first time, the teen seemed to truly hear Clint's words. He looked down at his skateboard, his fingers nervously picking at the edge of the grip tape. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. The teenager sat quietly, his usual smirk replaced by a thoughtful frown. For the first time, he wasn't trying to fire back a witty remark or look cool in front of his friends. Clint's words had cut deeper than he expected, forcing him to confront something he hadn't thought about before. Clint straightened up, glancing around the bus. "Here's the thing," he said, addressing not just the teen, but everyone listening. "Life isn't about proving how tough or clever you are. It's about the choices you make, the way you treat people. That's what really matters." A man sitting a few seats away nodded, murmuring, "He's right." Others on the bus exchanged quiet glances, the weight of Clint's words settling over them. The teen's friends shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to react. One of them finally leaned over and whispered, "Dude, maybe you should just apologize." The teenager hesitated, his face flushing red. He looked up at Clint, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "I was just messing around." Clint nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Maybe you were," he said. "But words matter, kid. They can hurt people, even when you don't mean them to." The teenager bit his lip, glancing down at the floor. "I guess I didn't think about it like that," he admitted. Clint stepped back, his gaze steady. "That's the problem," he said. "Most people don't think about the impact of what they say until it's too late." The teenager nodded, his face still red with embarrassment. But there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a small shift that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he seemed genuinely sorry. The bus rolled on, its passengers still captivated by the unexpected encounter. The teenager shifted in his seat, looking up at Clint with a mix of uncertainty and newfound respect. "So, what do I do now?" he asked quietly, his voice almost hesitant. Clint paused, his sharp eyes softening just slightly. "That's up to you," he said, "but if you're smart, you'll start by doing better. Respect isn't given for free, it's earned, and it starts with the way you treat people." The teenager nodded, the weight of Clint's words sinking in. He glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were still watching. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky but genuine. I'm sorry. To everyone. I didn't mean to cause a scene." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. The woman near the front of the bus gave him a small smile. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong," she said. "Good for you." The teen's friends nodded awkwardly, one of them patting him on the shoulder. "Yeah, man, that was cool of you to say." Clint gave a small nod of approval. "Not a bad start," he said. "But remember, respect isn't just about one moment, it's about what you do every day." The teenager looked up, his gaze steady now. "I'll remember that," he said. For the first time, his tone was free of sarcasm or bravado. It was genuine. As the bus approached the next stop, Clint stepped back toward his seat, his calm demeanor unchanged. The teenager watched him for a moment, then turned to his friends. "Hey, let's give up our seats for those people," he said, nodding toward a family standing near the front of the bus. His friends exchanged surprised glances, but followed his lead, standing up and gesturing to the family. "Here, you can sit," one of them said awkwardly. Clint watched the scene unfold, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. As the bus pulled up to the next stop, Clint stood, gripping the overhead rail for balance. The doors hissed open, and he turned toward the teenager one last time. "You've got potential, kid," he said, his voice steady. "Just make sure you use it for the right things." The teen looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for not just ignoring me," he said quietly. "I'll try to be better." Clint gave a small nod, tipping his hat slightly. "That's all anyone can ask." The other passengers watched as Clint stepped off the bus, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate rhythm. He didn't look back, disappearing into the bustling streets of San Francisco like a ghost of the Wild West. But his presence lingered, his words hanging in the air long after he'd gone. The bus continued its route, but the mood inside had shifted. Passengers who had been strangers just moments ago were now exchanging smiles and kind words. The teenager and his friends sat quietly, their earlier bravado replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. One passenger leaned toward the teenager, smiling. "You know," she said, "not many people get a lesson like that from Clint Eastwood himself. You're lucky." The teenager chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I am." As the bus rolled on, the teen stared out the window, his skateboard balanced against his knees. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what others thought of him. He was thinking about how he could be better, how he could earn the respect Clint had spoken about. And though Clint Eastwood was long gone, his impact on that bus, and on that teenager, wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon.